Our last presentation for the day, while you enjoy your lunch, is by my new friend, Dr. Pat Borgen. He is the chairman of surgery at Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn. He's also director of the Brooklyn Breast Cancer Program at Maimonides and clinical professor, Department of Surgery at SUNY Downstate University Hospital of Brooklyn. Recruited from Memorial Sloan Kettering, Dr. Borgen was Chief Breast Service, Head Breast Cancer Research Laboratory, and Director, Breast Cancer Disease Management Team at Memorial. So welcome, Dr. Borgen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. So since this is a lunch talk, I hate stages. I thought we would just have fun. And so what I want to do is give you what I think is an overview, maybe, of a field that's changing more rapidly than any of us ever thought that it would. And what I think some of the take-home messages are about the transitions that are happening and what we, as providers, as patients, nurses, navigators, really need to know so that we can be as certain as possible that our patients are getting the best possible care. My disclosures are listed here. I do not own stock in any of the companies I will mention or any successful American companies, as it turns out. So no breast surgeon starts talking about breast cancer without showing the numbers, 250,000 women. The incidence of breast cancer has really been stable, but the number of cases have gone up. The mortality rate has fallen significantly, but the number of women who die is relatively flat, and that's because there are more women alive today in the 6th, 7th, and 8th decade of life. And I'm going to start with a little bit about our population as a country, because we just had a superb presentation on the opioid epidemic in this country, and I want to just touch on how we're tackling this from the breast cancer perspective. 41,000 women are projected to die in 2020 of breast cancer. The largest survival gains we've seen are in women under the age of 50, and we'll talk a little bit about why that might be. So this represents 1970 through 2015, roughly, looking at change in survival per 100,000 women. And you see this, Americans, not women. And what you see here is the very bottom line, the light green, are Americans under the age of 25. And they have enjoyed the greatest improvement, the greatest reduction in early death. And we could probably spend a couple of hours talking about why that is. Is it immunizations? Is it antibiotics? Is it wearing helmets? Is it seat belts in cars? And maybe it's all of the above. But there are a couple of interesting lines. If you look at the light blue line that went down to 1980 and then popped up in the 25 to 44-year-old age group, what do you think caused that? What do you think that represented? Anybody? That's the HIV/AIDS epidemic, actually. That's HIV/AIDS. When you look at the top purple line, which are Americans over the age of 85, they have seen no improvement. And this is because of continued increases in Alzheimer's disease, organic brain syndrome. But if you look at Americans in the 45 to 54 age group, their survivorship has been flat since 1995. And that's the opioid epidemic. That's the opioid epidemic. So when you look at why people die, the purple line is drug deaths, and the blue line at the bottom are deaths from suicide, and you can see what has happened. And we had a beautiful presentation in the session just before this on the opioid epidemic. In 2020, 4/5 of Americans who get addicted to opioids started with an MD prescription. 4/5. So think about that for a moment, because we have a chance to make this better. This is our work in Brooklyn, where over the past 3 or 4 years, we have adopted an ERAS, Enhanced Recovery After Surgery Protocol, that is predicated upon a multidisciplinary approach to pain. clear liquids 2 hours before surgery, normothermia, gabapentin orally in the holding area, acetaminophen orally in the holding area, Exparel, liposomal bupivacaine mixed with bupivacaine as a field block in surgery, ketorolac, which we've shown really doesn't increase bleeding, and then NSAIDs postoperatively. So by October of 17, we have really almost eliminated, by July of 18, we've now eliminated opioids from all breast conservation surgery. So lumpectomy, sentinel node, axe dissection. We just submitted a paper to JAMA, wherein we did 1,200 consecutive patients with that operation without a single MME, without a single milligram of opioids, with pain scores that are better, frankly, than during the opioid era. And so there are 1 million, give or take a few, breast operations done in this country every year. 300,000 or so are cancer operations, 600,000 are other procedures. If we made a dent in those women undergoing breast surgery, in their opioids they took home, we could really begin to stem the tide of this. For the first time in the history of this country, our median survival as a country decreased for the last 3 years, almost all owing to the opioid epidemic. Now, how does the wealthiest nation on the planet begin to see its lifespan shorten? So we haven't gotten the numbers on 2019 yet, but the projections are between 75 and 95,000 Americans who will have died from opioids. So we've got to turn this around. And breast is an area where the disease is common enough and the surgeries are common enough that if we were able to adopt ERAS protocols, opioid reduction protocols, we could really make a dent in this crisis. So here's the mortality rate, steady decline, but the same number of women dying due to the more women alive. So what has led to this change has been different over the past 3 decades. And where we are currently is, I believe, that the success that we're seeing in really curing breast cancer, really improving the survivorship from breast cancer, has been fundamentally moving from a descriptive understanding of breast cancer. A pathologist, any pathologists here today? Oh, good. We can just make it up then. We've moved from a purely descriptive understanding of breast cancer to a functional understanding, and that's where the success has been. Anybody know what pink washing is? What's pink washing? Yeah, that's a great definition, actually. You're right. So part of the challenge we face in America is that everybody knows somebody with breast cancer, everybody. And people come to the table knowing something, often with preconceived notions, sometimes correct notions, sometimes not so much. But Madison Avenue found a way to sell products by painting them pink and saying we're giving 1/10 of 1 cent to breast cancer research. And it improves sales. But it's gotten out of control. Pink boxing gloves, pink toasters, Campbell's soup in a pink can seems a little gross to me. But how does buying a floating beer pong table translate into a message of I support breast cancer? It's really hard to figure that one out. By the way, when they do a deep dive on the funds, it's hard to prove that the dollars actually make their way into breast cancer research. It's hard to prove that. If you go to KFC in October, Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and you buy a pink bucket of chicken. So I founded the William F. Keck Laboratory in the Rockefeller Research Labs, and we studied the free fatty acids in things like fried chicken, and it's promotional. So ironically, by buying this bucket, you're simultaneously supporting both the cause and the cure at the same time, which is unique in American merchandising. Nothing says you support breast cancer like shooting an intruder with a pink I support breast cancer 9mm semi-automatic pistol. And this sold so many guns that 3 other gun manufacturers now make pink handguns. I think this is a problem. I think that it does not portray the seriousness of breast cancer, the lethality of breast cancer, and yet we have not made any progress in stemming the tide of pinkwashing. So the tumor on your left, your pathologist calls you and says, I have good news. This is a tubular breast cancer. This is an invasive breast cancer, and it is so well organized that the cancer cells are forming themselves into these nice donut-shaped ducts. This is a good guy. And the same pathologist calls and says, the tumor on the right is bad. The cells are pleomorphic, there are mitotic figures. This is a bad breast cancer. These are true cases, except the patient on that left died of multiple bone metastases, and the patient on the right after treatment lived 30 years. This is a problem of using morphology to predict breast cancer behavior. We cannot use morphology, and I didn't hear the presentation this morning. I wish I had. I'm going to respectfully disagree with my colleague. I don't think that we're blessed with intuitive skills that allow us to say, this is a good guy and that's a bad guy, especially when there are genomic profiling platforms available to tell us. You can look at a sports car and say, that looks like a fast car. It's red, low to the ground, probably expensive. But unless you know the engine and everything else, you can't really tell. So I used to do this really ridiculous game, and I will apologize. What's your first name?
Ada.
Any children? Do you have any kids? So let's say your son comes to you and says, Mom, I want you to help me pick my prom date. And he's holding this high school yearbook. And these are the 5 bachelorettes. And you say, well, Aiden, is it Aiden?
Ada.
Ada, tell me about these young women. And he says, Mom, this is based on morphology. He's a smart kid. So looking at the picture, who would you choose? Bachelorette 1 through 5. Just looking at the pictures. 1. How about this table? Who would you guys choose? What do you think?
Big smile.
We have 2 votes for number 1. How about this table? Who would you choose?
The blonde. You say 5.
Number 5. Okay. So, Bachelorette number 1 is Athena Onassis. She is the wealthiest woman on the planet Earth. You have chosen wisely. The other 4 are serial killers. Not so much for number 5. She is out of prison now, so she's available. I am going to argue throughout my remarks, I'm going to argue that this is not different than looking down a microscope at a breast cancer. I'm going to argue that we can't tell. And as silly as this exercise is, in my career, countless times I thought a breast cancer was a good guy, only to learn later that it came back in the liver or the brain or the lungs or the bone. And so we've got to move from this purely descriptive understanding of this disease to a functional understanding. And there are many ways to do that with ER positive, estrogen receptor positive, HER2 negative breast cancer. The best of breed is the 21 gene oncotype assay. The new parent company is Exact Sciences. I do not own stock in Exact Sciences. But this is the best of breed, and it's so much the best of breed that it's part of the staging system for breast cancer now. So as we look at ER positive, HER2 negative tumors, we need to understand the oncotype score in order to make decisions about treatment. I'll talk a little bit at the end about susceptibility genetic testing, which are beginning to play a role, by the way. They're beginning to make inroads into how we actually treat breast cancer. 4 days ago, this remarkable paper was published in Nature, which sort of blew everybody away, because what these guys from the University of Zurich did was they developed a technology to simultaneously assess 35 biomarkers in individual breast cancer cells, 35 biomarkers in individual cancer cells. And then they used an imaging technology that allowed them to create maps within individual cells. They looked at the phenotype of the cell, and then they looked at the outcome. And then they looked at how these 370-odd women did. What they reported was fascinating. Two things that they reported. One is that breast cancers form communities. Like cells grow together within breast cancers, and there are communities in the microenvironment of vasculature, of hormones, and they produce some fantastic photographs of what breast cancer communities look like. At the end, they concluded that they could identify 87 different types of breast cancer. 87. Now, we always thought there were probably 20 or there might be 30. This paper, published in Nature, says there are at least 87 different types of breast cancer. We can't distinguish those with the naked eye. So this is 4 days ago in Nature, if you want to do a deeper dive into this. I think it's completely fascinating. So I'm going to start with the area where we have gotten it the most wrong with morphology, and that is with DCIS. Because I'm going to argue that all of the trials that we designed and our current treatment of DCIS is based on a completely flawed understanding of what DCIS is. And that we have been I'm going to argue that we've been over-treating DCIS. So as you know, breast cancers can either arise in the lobules, the milk-producing gland, or the duct, and that ductal breast cancers, invasive ductal breast cancers, are far more common than lobular breast cancers. And there's this condition where it appears that we see cancer cells trapped within the basement membrane of a duct. And we call that DCIS, duct carcinoma in situ. And there are different types and there are different varieties. We've been treating this condition as though 100% of the time it will become invasive cancer. Every study we've ever done has made the assumption that DCIS, if untreated, bingo, becomes invasive cancer. While the evidence against that has been unbelievably robust. I'm going to take you very briefly through that. So, I'm going to try to convince you that most DCIS, certainly more than 60%, was either never going to become invasive or was going to become invasive at such a slow rate that it might not be clinically relevant. So that's the hypothesis of this, and that's where we're going to go for the next 5 or so minutes. Are these dots on this domino thing going into the screen or coming out towards you? What do you see? You see them in. Yeah, I see them in too. If you take that block and you flip it 180 degrees, what do you see? Out, right? Most people do. And that's because our brain is hardwired to make two assumptions. Number one, a single light source, and from above. So your brain, when it sees something, assumes a single light source and from above. So these are called heuristics. Heuristics are shortcuts that our brain takes that allows us to make rapid decisions. I'm not going to step in this hole because I don't know how deep it is. We don't stop and think about that. We just step around the hole. I'm going to tell you that these men are exactly the same size. Because of the context, because of those diagonal lines, your brain says that's bullshit. The guy on the left is much smaller than the guy on the right. But if you draw a circle and you simply move the circle, that's a little distressing. Because even when you know that those men are the same size, you look at this and you say, nope, guy in the front's littler. I'm sorry. That's a heuristic, right? That's a contextual heuristic. We're looking at that and we're making... So I have a daughter who is a freshman at Rutgers University. And about 2 years ago, as she was in driver's ed, she came to me and said, do you think that square A and square B are the same shade of gray? And I thought, oh my God, she can't see. She's taking driver's ed at Marlboro High School, and she can't see. Because it's clear to me that one's dark and one's light. She said, no, you're completely wrong. They're the same shade of gray. So she said, take PowerPoint and just cover everything else up. It's a little disturbing, right? And this is not a trick. If you cover it, even when you know B is the same shade as A, your brain looks at it and it says, I see two different shades here. And it's hard to convince your brain without removing the distractions. So again, I'm going to argue that this is exactly what we, as breast cancer doctors and researchers, have done with DCIS. We have made the assumption that since invasive ductal cancer is so common, that DCIS has to become invasive cancer. And that's absolutely not true. So these are my goals. I want to convince you that some DCIS, most, was not going to become invasive, and that we have testing available to identify that subset. So the first line of evidence is that we didn't see DCIS before screening mammography, okay? But the incidence of DCIS, the slope of the incidence paralleled the popularization of mammography. The more mammograms we did, the more DCIS we saw. And no matter how you analyze this or any country you look at, the incidence of DCIS paralleled that of the popularization and the usage of mammography. Now that either means that those damn mammograms were causing DCIS, probably not true, or that we were finding something that was unlikely to have become clinically seen. Here's an interesting slide. Analog mammography, which was done up through 2005, the incidence of DCIS was 12,000 cases a year. When we went digital, we doubled the incidence of DCIS. And now with higher resolution mammography, you can see we've continued to increase DCIS, while the incidence of invasive cancer has stayed flat, completely flat. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are autopsy series looking at women who died of other causes where the breast tissue was carefully studied. DCIS was way more common in those patients than in screening studies. There were misdiagnosis series, at least 4 of them, with hundreds of thousands of patients, where DCIS was missed on a biopsy and the patient was followed. Only a third of those women ever developed breast cancer. My group at Sloan did a review of 3,000 patients with DCIS, and 115 of those patients had DCIS that was essentially cut in half. The patient had no further surgery, no radiation, and no tamoxifen. 30% of those women got breast cancer over the next 15 years. And so I have to put those things together and conclude that the majority of DCIS was really not going to become invasive. Some will, of course, but the majority won't. So that means that if I have a small focus of DCIS and I'm giving radiation, any radiation therapists here? Good, much safer. Whew. That was close. So that means if I'm taking out small foci of DCIS and I'm radiating everybody, I'm over-treating this disease. It can't possibly be beneficial to radiate DCIS that was not going to become an invasive breast cancer. It can't help. So there is a genomic profiling platform, also from our friends at Genomic Health, which is a 12-gene assay. It is a subset of the 21-gene assay I mentioned that we use in invasive ER-positive, HER2-negative breast cancer. 2 landmark studies looking at archival DCIS. The samples were tested, predictions were made, it was then unblinded. And I'll call your attention to the top line, the green line. So first of all, 2/3 of the patients were found to be low recurrence risk. What did that mean? It meant a risk of 1% per year for 10 years of any in situ or invasive disease, but a risk of invasive disease of 1 in 200 per year, 5%. These are women treated with lumpectomy alone, no radiation. This model does not contain the gene for estrogen, the estrogen receptor. And so tamoxifen, endocrine ablative therapies did not change these results. So a second study was done in Canada with exactly the same results. So on the genomic profiling studies, 2/3 of the patients had a low recurrence score. Certainly in the 5% or less risk of invasive carcinoma over the next 10 years. Now, Does this mean they shouldn't be radiated? No. But it means they should have a conversation that says, we think your risk is 5%, and radiation will cut it to 2.5. So the patient can then make a decision based on facts. If I tell a patient there's a 40% less chance of this coming back if I radiate, everybody says yes. If I say your risk is 2% and I'm going to make it 1%, very few people would say yes. So this is an emerging tool that we have. In every aspect of breast cancer, we have tried to move away from a one-size-fits-all world. We need to do this in DCIS and in radiation. We need to move away from everybody with DCIS getting radiation. Radiation is a powerful tool. It can be used once in a woman's lifetime in that quadrant of the body. And we should use the radiation when it's the most valuable to us. And so this is a work in progress. So basically, the majority of DCIS is screen detected. Breast conservation is appropriate. The current recommendations for surgical margins are 2 millimeters. That's completely insane to me. If my knife went 1 millimeter further, my margins are okay. If they went a millimeter this way. Anyway, it's what we have. Mastectomy, nipple-sparing mastectomy is appropriate in the majority of patients. The only 2 contraindications to nipple-sparing mastectomy are DCIS that involves the major lactiferous ducts as they go into the nipple, or cosmetically, if the native nipple is not going to be in the correct location. So, any questions about DCIS? Thoughts, questions, anything? Before we briefly move into invasive breast cancer, any questions? Did I convince you that most DCIS doesn't invade? I hope. Yeah, if you don't make that leap, then the rest of it doesn't make much sense. But hopefully I convince you. So now, as I said earlier, 90% of invasive breast cancers are ductal. A little less than 10% are lobular. The photomicrograph on the lower right-hand corner shows this linear growth pattern of lobular cancers. Lobular cancers lose a cell adhesion molecule called E-cadherin, and when they undergo mitosis, they divide in a sequential way. The clinical manifestation is not trivial. Lobular cancers grow in thin sheets. Ductal cancers grow in all directions at the same time, and so they make a nice lump, a nice mass. Much higher rate of false negativity on mammography with lobular cancers. Lobular cancers are almost always diagnosed at a higher stage because you can imagine if you've got this thin sheet in the breast, the exam is usually normal, and a mammogram may miss it. So let's look at a sample patient, and we'll go through how she would be treated today for HIPAA. I can't tell you her real name. So she is on the left. She is a 450-year-old woman we will call Night. She was sculpted by Michelangelo in the latter part of the 16th century. She flanks the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici in the San Lorenzo Chapel in Florence, Italy. And she's flanked by her partner, who is called Dawn. And a number of years ago, about 2000, art historians and oncologists got together and said, there's a mass in her left breast. And if you zoom in on this, in fact, there is a 4 to 5 centimeter mass pressing upward and inward in the upper inner quadrant of the left breast. And so initially, and a lot of computer reconstructions were done, and some art historians said, well, Michelangelo was having a bad day. But it turns out that he didn't have bad days. It turns out that in no other breast form that he ever sculpted was there an abnormality. And so the conclusion, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in November of 2000, was that it is likely that the model who sat for Michelangelo had breast cancer. It is likely. Now, the intriguing part is whether he knew it or not. Because imagine if he was trying to send a message of human frailty mixed with beauty. Maybe he understood that she had a life-threatening condition. How how would she be treated? So this is 1580. There was no treatment for breast cancer for 300 years. The next appointment was 300 years. So I tell our call center this all the time as they bitch about our call wait times, that she had a 300-year wait time. So we're doing pretty good. Radical mastectomy was the only treatment for breast cancer in the United States of America until just after World War II. And then we went through this period of extended radical mastectomy, where not only the breast and the lymph nodes were taken, but the sternum was split and the internal mammary nodes were taken, and that did not improve survival. To the era of modified radical mastectomy, where we spared the muscle of the chest wall, we took the breast and the lymph nodes, into the era of breast conservation therapy. So today, if Knight was diagnosed in New Jersey, she would have extensive tumor profiling. She would not only steroid hormone binding receptors like ER and PR, she would have HER2 new testing, she would have a proliferative index called Ki-67. If she was stage 4, we would automatically get BRCA testing regardless of her family history, and there's a chance we would want PD-1, PD-L1 testing as well. We would also scan her from head to toe. So this would be the first step for our patient. This is unnecessarily complicated, but it shows how many different ways we can treat breast cancer. And this is even oversimplified because we've left out the molecular markers from this slide. I show this slide to make the case that breast cancer is a team sport. You're not seeking out the expert surgeon, the expert oncologist, the expert radiation guy. You want the expert team. So the expert team today is more important than the team of experts. You want a team that works together, that can look at this disease from every perspective and come to you with a treatment recommendation that gives our patients the best chances of a cure. So as a healthcare provider or a patient, there are about 7 classes of drugs I think you need to just know are there. And I'm going to run through them, one slide each, no details. I'll talk a little bit about blocking estrogen. I will not talk about cytotoxic chemotherapy. And then the other 5 are really important to understand because they are revolutionizing the cure rates in stage 3 and even in stage 4 breast cancer. We're seeing almost staggeringly large improvements in cure rates. So estrogen is important. We as a country have underestimated the power of blocking estrogen for too long. In the 1990s, every woman with a tumor larger than 1 centimeter, node negative, got chemotherapy. 1 centimeter and above. And at Memorial Sloan Kettering, we had a tumor stretcher. So if your tumor was 8 millimeters, we'd stretch it and make it 10 millimeters so that you got chemotherapy. So everybody got chemotherapy. And this was because there were 2 intergroup trials in the node-negative setting that showed a small but statistically meaningful benefit to survival for women who got chemo. Now, when you applied that nationally, there were about 1,000 lives that were saved. But with massive overtreatment in the 1990s for a garden variety T1 N0 breast cancer, we were treating about 100 women to help 6. We just didn't know who the 6 were. And so every patient got treated. Now, the estrogen receptor was discovered in the 1960s, tamoxifen was developed in the 60s into the 70s, and we have always underestimated the power of blocking estrogen. But you know, as healthcare providers, that half of our patients will benefit more in the receptor positive group, half of them will benefit much more from simply blocking estrogen than from chemotherapy. In fact, in the early trials of chemo, you can argue that premenopausal women got part of their benefit because chemo made them postmenopausal, right? And so in the era of neoadjuvant endocrine ablative therapy, we're behind the rest of the world. We're behind the rest of the world. And we're making strides. It's sometimes hard to tell a patient, you have breast cancer, I'm going to give you this pill. Because it doesn't feel very proactive. It doesn't feel like you're being aggressive. Is my hair going to fall out? No. Am I going to get sick? No. And so And then, so we have three ways to block estrogen. The area to keep your eye on is the third category, which are the estrogen receptor downregulators, where there are 2 oral ESRDs that are in the pipeline we believe nearing approval. Remember that fulvestrant Faslodex today is given through a deep intramuscular shot that hurts like hell. And especially in older patients, it's really hard. So keep your eye on that space, because I believe sometime later this year, we'll have approval of an oral ESRD. I'll talk about CDK4/6 inhibitors. mTORs are interesting because mTORs can be used to re-recruit ER-positive cells back into the fight. A patient who responded to blocking estrogen, who then became resistant, we can use mTOR inhibitors to re-recruit the estrogen receptor back into the battle. In the ER-positive, HER2 negative setting, node-negative and early node-positive group, we are using the 21-gene assay. This is a trial that you've probably seen called TAILORx, showed us that in the low-risk group, there was not even a 1% benefit to chemotherapy. In what we used to call the intermediate group, now a 1% benefit from chemotherapy. So TAILORx holds the promise of decreasing the overuse of chemo in a substantial portion of our patients. And these are the 21 genes that are represented in the assay. 2 sample reports. The one on the left is a low recurrence score in a node-positive patient. In the past, we always gave node-positive patients chemotherapy. This patient, you can see from the third box, no benefit from chemotherapy. And then the patient on the right has a node-negative breast cancer, but a high recurrence score. And this patient will benefit significantly from chemotherapy. So this is a tool we have to use to decide which of our patients are going to get simply estrogen blockade or estrogen blockade plus cytotoxic chemotherapy. Exciting new class of drugs that are able to block a cell from going from GO resting to G1. These are called CDK4/6 inhibitors. There are 3 of them that are commercially available. They are first-line therapy for metastatic ER-positive, HER2-negative breast cancer. There are subtle differences between palbociclib, ribociclib. The unique thing about abemaciclib is that it is not only a 4/6 inhibitor, but is also a cyclin 2 inhibitor. So there are 2 checkpoints that abema works at. And again, these are very, very effective drugs in the stage 4 setting. I won't talk about HER2, but suffice it to say that early in my career, this was the bad actor. Most patients with HER2 positive breast cancer died of their disease pre-trastuzumab. It was much more feared than triple negative breast cancer was. And today we have a plethora of drugs that attack this incredible target, so much so that HER2 positivity downstages you now. If you come in with a stage 2 breast cancer that's HER2 positive, it's classified as a stage 1 breast cancer. That's because of the effectiveness of targeting of the HER2 receptor. The most exciting drugs on the horizon are called antibody-drug conjugates. These are the future of chemotherapy, we believe, in cancer. It is a molecule on one end that will bind to something, in this case HER2, a linker, and then a tiny dose of chemotherapy. And that brings the chemotherapy into the cells that express HER2. So the dose of chemo is very small. These are called ADCs, or antibody-drug conjugates. I'll talk, the one that's approved and that's used in clinical practice is called Kadcyla, or TDM1, and this is standard of care now, and I'll show you how this drug is used. There are a number of other ADCs that are in development, not only in the HER2 space, but in other spaces. And again, this is how it works. That HER2 binding domain finds cells that overexpress HER2. They link to the receptor. The molecule is internalized into what eventually becomes a lysosome, and that bursts, and the chemotherapy is now inside of the cell. Really cool. This is the future. And then finally, and I love, so my former boss at Sloan won the Nobel Prize last year for the discovery of something called CTLA-4, Jim Allison, and we always wondered, why doesn't our immune system, it fights the common cold. It fights skin rashes. Why can't our immune system fight our breast cancer? And the reason partly was that cancers evolved in a way that they made themselves invisible to the immune system. Cancer cells express receptors, and the one I'm going to focus on is PD-L1 and PD-1, where you have a PD-L1 receptor on a tumor cell and a PD-1 receptor on the T cell. And when those bind, the cancer cell is not seen by the T cell. The cancer cell says, nothing to see here, keep moving. So there's a brief clip, the way you can remember this, that I stole from one of the Star Wars movies. Let's see if we can just play this. It's a 10-second video. And this is sort of,
How long have you had these droids?
About 3 or 4 seasons?
Yeah, for se-
Let me see your identification.
You don't need to see his identification.
We don't need to see his identification.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
He can go about his business.
You can go about your business.
Move along.
Move along.
so that ridiculous example is exactly what happens with PD-1 and PD-L1. The T cells never saw the breast cell, cancer cells. The T cells never saw the breast cancer cells. And so now we have drugs that block that receptor, that block either PD-1 or PD-L1 or both. And those are now mainstream. I'll share with you how we're using them currently. So if our patient night, in conclusion, had an ER-positive, HER2-negative, stage 3 breast cancer, she would get chemotherapy and an aromatase inhibitor. But if she recurred systemically, she would get the cell cycle controller, CDK4/6, and an aromatase inhibitor, and if she recurred after that, she might get an mTOR inhibitor. In the triple-negative space, in San Antonio, about 4 weeks ago, a trial called Keynote 522 showed that a PD-L1 inhibitor called pembrolizumab was effective in the neoadjuvant space. And so this year, what I believe you'll see is that pembro will be coupled with conventional either anthracycline or taxane-based chemotherapy as neoadjuvant therapy for triple-negative. Last year, a trial called Impassion 130 showed us that atezolizumab, which is another PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitor, is effective in the stage 4 setting when triple-negative breast cancers metastasize. So her first-line treatment for metastatic disease would be atezolizumab and a nanotechnology taxane called Abraxane, nab-paclitaxel. If she was HER2 positive, it's easy. We have lots of ways to block HER2. If we did neoadjuvant anthracycline or taxane-based chemo with double targeting of HER2, trastuzumab and pertuzumab, and she did not have a path CR, she would get TDM1, the antibody drug conjugate that I showed you. And then that would also be first-line therapy now in the stage 4 setting. Finally, BRCA pathogenic mutation carriers who have metastatic breast cancer that's HER2 negative respond extremely well to a class of drugs called PARP inhibitors. And so virtually all stage 4 patients today, HER negative, HER2 negative, will get BRCA testing to see whether they are a candidate for PARP inhibition. So how would she have fared? Well, we know that in the 16th century, women lived about 2 years after their breast cancer was found. It was only marginally better at the beginning of the 20th century. By 1950, a little bit better. 2000, better. And today, the line didn't pop in. Today, about 50% of patients across all of stage 3 disease will live 10 years or longer. 50%. And so I think very real progress has been made and is being made. So in conclusion then, This is, as you are well aware, a family of diseases, and it requires a team. It requires a multidisciplinary team. I love this cartoon. I don't have time to see a crazy salesman. We have a battle to fight. So we have actually gone back in our practice in Brooklyn to inviting industry into our tumor boards. We want them there. This is complicated. And so this notion that two companies selling tetracycline are going to bias the jury is crazy. And so we are one of the first centers that openly invites industry to our tumor board. And we protect HIPAA, we protect the privacy of our patients. But industry is our partner in this, and understanding what's doable and what's affordable and what's not affordable. The real challenge with TDM1 is its costs, more than $100,000 per year per patient. If it's my wife, I want you to spend $100,000. As a country, it's harder to wrap our mind around that. And so our tumor boards are unique in that industry is present. We continue to work on our team. Ultimately, the patient care at the center is the most important thing. And so finally, I promise, I will do a shameless plug for my conference that I chair in Miami. This year it's held on March 5 through 8. Miami Beach does not suck in March. This is a truly multidisciplinary meeting. It's entirely case-based. We present cases like you would back home, ask a question, do audience response, and then the speaker addresses the question. It's intensely practical. Our motto is here at Friday, use it on Monday. If you decide to go to Miami, and I hope you will, you can use a code online, MBC20 Borgen, and that will knock 35% off of the outrageously high registration cost. So I think with that, I want to thank you. I want to thank Komen Foundation for inviting me to speak to you today. Thank you very much. Sure, of course.
Are there any questions?
Question, yes, sir.
So have
Here,
you
hold on,
looked
I'll
at,
bring
the major problem is that people undergo therapeutic, either like chemo or treatment, become resistant. Have you looked at what is,
I'm sorry, I didn't.
how can overcome the chemo resisting and also immuno treatment resisting? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is what about overcoming resistance? And that's always going to be a challenge. And tumors certainly learn to overcome immunotherapy. With chemotherapies, I would argue that the benefit of neoadjuvant treatment is you can see if the chemo is working or not. If it's resistant initially, then you know you have to give a different treatment. I think studying resistance is a huge issue. But I will say that we now have third, fourth, fifth, even sixth line regimens for most types of breast cancer. The mistake that I see that's made is people give up. I've given you 2 regimens, Mrs. Jones. I can't do any more. That's almost always a mistake. So I think that the science behind resistance is important. But by the way, breast cancers morph. If you look at all metastatic breast cancers, where the MET responds and then it doesn't, if you rebiopsy that, they've changed 20% of the time. ER positive becomes ER negative, HER2 negative becomes HER2 positive. So I think it's a great question, but much more work to be done on that. So other questions, other thoughts, questions? Anybody doing ERAS protocols back home to spare opioids? We can make my...
He raised his hand right behind
Oh,
you.
I know, my buddy from Shrewsbury. But if you want a copy of the protocol that we use for your institution, we'll share it with you. I mean, this is all, we want all patients to, so I don't know if you can put my email address on the website or whatever.
Yep.
But feel free to email me, and if you want a copy of our ERAS protocol of how we've essentially eliminated opioids, please, I'm happy to share it with you. Okay, thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much. Oh, so I just want to say thank you to Dr.